Coffee, Cows, and Crops is produced by the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association and hosted by Extension Coordinator Johanna Murray. On this podcast, we discuss management practices and research results with scientists, ranchers, researchers, and farmers. We strive to share innovative information and farming practices supported by sound science and practical wisdom. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get learning. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Coffee, Cows, and Crops. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Norine Ambrose from Cows and Fish again, and we'll be talking about livestock behavior on pasture and planning for the grazing season. But before we get into all that fun stuff, Norine, would you mind introducing yourself again and how you got started with Cows and Fish?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Johanna. I'm based in southern Alberta right now, but I was born in central Alberta in the Bashaw area and grew up on a mixed farm. And I really wanted to work in science, but I really wanted to be relevant and practical and, not just sort of science that was for theory, but for utility. And I think the work I do with Cows and Fish is really helpful. It's finding practical solutions to real situations like grazing management, for instance, around water bodies. So that's kind of how I got started, in a lucky break for me 22 years ago when Cows and Fish posted this job.
Right on. So we're going to talk a bit today about managing for the 4 principles of range management. But before we get right into that, can you talk about quickly what those principles of range management are?
Yeah, thank you. 4 principles would be: the first is balance your supply with your demand, as in you can't take more than there is. Providing effective rest, so that gives that chance for the plants to regrow and recoup, kind of ready to grow again. Balancing your distribution, you might want even distribution or some other kind of planned distribution. Maybe you want patchy distribution even in some cases. And then avoiding vulnerable periods. So that's looking at sensitive times where you have considerations for the plants or the soil that you want to put into your planning.
Right, that makes sense. So the biggest one I want to talk about today is even distribution of livestock, because that's one we talk about a lot because it's hard to achieve. Because when you're dealing with actual animals, they do whatever they want, especially in big pastures. So can you talk a bit about what the goal is of equal spread of livestock and how maybe we can achieve that in a practical way?
Yeah, generally the reason we want even distribution is because we want even use and not overuse or underuse in some areas, right? You're trying to sort of balance your pasture use so that it's to whatever amount or level or percentage that you're happy with, and that is your intent. But of course, cows and other livestock like to make their own decisions some of the times and hang out in their favorite spots, right? Just like we like to hang out in our favorite spots. So that means that they tend to overuse their favorite spots close to the gate, wherever they were initially put in, or near the water and the riparian area, near the salt. They hang out in those favorite areas because, well, why wouldn't they if they can? And so, really the ways to address that are a few things, but the first one is really trying to fence like with like. So, a lot of our fencing in the past was done on quarter section lines, basically property boundaries that have nothing necessarily to do with the landscape that's getting grazed. It might be half forest, half tame pasture, some riparian or wetland. It might be native grassland. It's a whole mixture of things, and they have different preferences, like different kinds of grazing preferences for that kind of forage, but also the topography, right? You got a steep hill and you got a low valley bottom. Those things don't go well together sometimes in terms of encouraging your cattle to use them evenly. Mm-hmm. So really the first thing is fencing like with like, or when you can. Obviously that's not always realistic, but definitely temporary fencing even can be really helpful if you aren't changing permanent or perimeter fencing.
Right. So are there some natural tendencies of cattle, speaking of them kind of doing what they want, that we should be aware of when we're working to improve distribution or usage of pasture?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of good sort of behavioral research out there using like livestock collars and things like that to sort of map out what cows do. And I mean, in general, and probably most people who run beef cattle know this already, but cow-calf pairs tend to be less range interested, they are, going to use a little bit less steep slopes compared to, say, if you've got yearlings. They're more likely to be kind of a little wilder if they're heifers and steers who are off on their own. They climb steeper slopes. They'll use more far-ranging places. In general, beef cattle aren't going to want to use anything over 10%, and that 1 to 10% range slope is kind of, starts to really see a major drop off. So steeper slopes, of course, deter them. Also distance to water. Now, depending where you are, they can go long distances, but kind of at the 300 and 400 meter mark, there's a major change in how they spend their time. So they might walk further than that to get water because they have to, but in general, like once you get past that point, it totally influences their distribution. So if you can plan your water, or if you have multiple watering sources, or resize your pasture units or paddocks if you're using paddocks, to keep that in mind, that's kind of important. They also, most manure buildup is within 20 to 30 meters of shelter. So they're hanging out under the trees or wherever their shelter, and that's where the manure gets left, right? So that means that's because they're spending a lot of time there. So looking for those opportunities, or maybe moving them around if you have portable options, or again, how you might want to create temporary fencing. The other really important thing, that the reason I mentioned like with like, is the forage itself changes. So not only do you maybe have forested pasture, tame pasture, and native grassland, or any combination of things, it also changes over the year. So if you have a mixture of kinds of forage, some parts of that forage are really palatable in the springtime, right? So maybe you've got early brome and timothy that's really great, and they want to seek that out, and they're ignoring some of the coarser, rougher grasses that are cool season that grow a little later. But then late season, you have them seeking out trees and shrubs because they have a really high nutritional value. And the grasses have kind of either mostly been consumed, or like if you have Kentucky bluegrass, it's not as palatable and it's kind of withered away. Or if you graze in the winter, same thing, that there's a reason that rough fescue is really well suited to winter grazing in the south part of the province and in the prairie parkland in the Peace region, because it holds its structure compared to, say, something like Kentucky bluegrass if it's in your pasture, which doesn't really hold its structure very well. So kind of really important to look at what you have on your place and how it's related to the other pieces of things you have. So whether it's next to the water that you have, maybe it's portable. The water is, the grass might not be, right? So.
Right. That makes sense. I know, I can't remember who the speaker was now, but we were listening to one guy talk, and he is talking about fertilization. So when you mentioned like with like, and how most of the manure is under the shade, he was talking about how, your manure is there, it's just under the trees, not out on your grass where you want it. So if you fence like with like a little bit more, you get better fertilization of your grass.
Yeah, and as a general rule, the trees don't want that. Like, not only does it result in additional compaction, but they don't need those nutrients. Like you look at pastures that have kind of a mixture of pasture, of probably tame pasture in a lot of cases, and patches of, aspen or poplar, and even willow in wetter areas. And that compaction actually is hard on their roots, and it keeps down all the seedlings and saplings that would allow for natural regeneration to happen. They don't need the nutrients, and they don't need the compaction or the browse or the rubbing, because cows like to rub on things. So yeah, you're right. Distribution, and therefore that distribution results in overuse in those places and underutilization, including the nutrients being in the wrong place, that you could benefit from them being somewhere else.
Yeah. So in addition to maybe moving the water around, moving the salt around, maybe changing your fencing strategy, especially with temporary fencing, are there other ways that you'd like to mention where you can work with the tendencies of the animals and the preferences of the animals instead of against them?
Yeah, so aside from kind of, the natural system pieces you have, like the type of grass or forage and where the water is, there's some really interesting stuff that I think is really underutilized. Herd training, so pushing, herding them into the places you want them. Of course, if you're using defined paddocks that are really small and using intensive use, then you're maybe controlling that, but on a more extensive grazing settings, like actually encouraging them and training and using, the mothers who've been there before to train their young. And you often hear how somebody buys cows from somewhere else and they don't seem to know how to use it. It's because they aren't familiar with the plant. The plant community can be quite different, let alone the lay of the land. They're not familiar with. There are also different plant communities in the different parts of the province. So that's part of it. There's some really cool research that was done like more than 10 years ago now, that started in New Mexico, where they looked at different breeds. So it's kind of the classic hill climber, bottom dweller. So Tarantays are kind of now, which is not a very common breed, certainly in Alberta, but Herefords were compared. So, and then crosses between them, like 1/4 and 1/3 crosses. And really Tarantays, because they come from breeding that was in mountainous areas, are hill climbers. They actually spend a lot of time in more rough terrain and steeper slopes compared to Herefords, which were developed in, British Isles, basically in flatter land, who definitely spend more of their time on flat and low slope lands, hence being called bottom dwellers in this study. So you can do that, I think with your own herd. And I think it's a really underutilized opportunity to say, well, I should be watching which mother and her, if she's heifers and I'm going to keep those heifers, which ones are on the hillside spreading out, or which ones are always just hanging out in the spot that they're already overutilizing. I think, you can do that in addition to, looking for breeds that are relevant. You can look at your own behavior of your livestock and your animals. Just like you choose for good feet or good mothering instincts, you can choose for, how they use the pasture too. Another one I would suggest is, even just training on forages. We've heard people talk about how they can train on weeds. I encourage them to eat certain kinds of, weedy plants they're not poisonous. They're just generally not something we want in our pasture, and encouraging them. I think, that herding and sort of encouraging to spend time or making them spend time in places with their less preferred is an option. Obviously, you have to give them enough quality feed for their health and well-being, but you can actually get them used to eating things that they're not used to if they came from a different area, or are always just avoiding their less favorite things and eating only the ice cream stuff, right?
So another one of the main principles of range management is to avoid fragile times of year. But like we've said before, like the plant species and moisture and all of that sort of stuff has an effect on that timing, like when things are at their most fragile. So how should people go about deciding what time to graze a certain pasture?
Yeah, it will depend on everybody's goals, right? But you generally are trying to graze it when you have the highest value and quality of your forage, but that's not always possible because that's a really narrow spot. You can't be everywhere at the same time, as people often find that issue, right? I can't move quick enough to get to the newest, best stuff. But in general, I mean, you want to, in addition to obviously trying to hit when it's highest value and highest abundance, or some combination of those things, you don't want to negatively affect plant vigor. So you want to do that and also not affect soil, right? You don't want to negatively affect the soils, which usually is springtime when they're soft, wet, and compactable. It can happen after a rain event or a high, really moist few weeks of summertime too, of course, or fall. You're trying to avoid damaging the soil and the plants. That's the rationale you want to look at when to graze, in addition to, of course, feed your cows. But so it's going to be different for each person, but I would say the goal is to make sure that whatever you're taking from the plant leaves enough behind, and don't take it from that plant until it's ready, until it's got enough above ground mass so that it's had a chance to store some energy in the roots. And that's true for all grazing. You want to have a healthy plant so it can regrow for the next grazing opportunity. So considering things like species at risk or nesting of waterfowl or birds might be part of your consideration too. You're trying to, maybe you have an ability to defer grazing in the spring during those earlier seasons for other reasons that aren't just, agricultural grazing related. So those might be other things you want to look at, but generally you want the health of the plant and the soil it's relying on to be maintained.
So a lot of people who talk about regenerative grazing also talk about not grazing at the same time of every year. So how would you recommend changing up grazing time of sensitive areas? Because obviously you want to change the grazing time, but you don't want to run into that where you're grazing at a bad time of year.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the ideal situation is avoiding sensitive times altogether if you can, but you have to have your cows somewhere all the time, obviously. And, often that means they're going to be in a pasture or pastures at some component of sensitive time, whether that's in the spring or in the fall or, whatever that might be. So generally what I would suggest as a good rule of thumb is if you grazed it in a sensitive time, let's say in this year, then next year you want to go past that point before you go back in. So let's say you had to use it your earliest spring pasture, earliest summer pasture, you're in there this year for that timeline, but you should avoid using it in that same timeline the next year, and really avoid the same timeline next year in general. But that means you need to actually delay going past it, because if you shorten it and you go in before you were there the previous year, you're actually sort of adding on top of the sensitive impact because you give it less time to recuperate, right? So you're trying to say, I'm going to give it a little bit extra to recuperate because I was in there when it was sensitive. And that's sort of true for whatever timing is sensitive for your situation. I would also say that in terms of the different times of year, you end up with a lot of different selectivity, right? So they're going to target different things in a pasture if they're at that pasture at a different time. So that can be a real benefit. You can actually encourage them to use one kind of thing this year, and later this year or again next year when you're back in, and if they're using it at a very different time of year, they'll probably graze it very differently.
Right. That makes sense. And speaking of sensitive times or sensitive areas and times of year, Cows and Fish does a lot of work with riparian areas. So when people start discussing things like managed grazing and fencing livestock out of riparian areas and maybe where the trees are, there's a lot of concern about heat stress and shade. So how do we manage that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of producers out on the prairie who've no shade and no shelter. So cows can obviously handle it, but it is nice to give them those opportunities, not just from shade from sun, but also wind protection, right? Not whether it's heat or cold or energy loss, you're trying to also make them more efficient animals and not waste energy. So I think people have really started to recognize the value of natural trees, whether that's in a riparian area, a chunk of bush pasture, or it's along your fence line. Try not to, again, encourage poor distribution by putting the salt close by, right? Or the water, like trying to, again, use those distribution tools in different places, because the trees are a place they're attracted to for the cover you just talked about. The other thing is a lot of people are fencing out some of their trees, like almost to create them as a windbreak that's fenced, or a shelter shade area that's fenced. Like they might be fenced at the very edge so that the cows can still use them as a protective resource, right? And of course, there's obviously habitat values and things like that as well. So that's an option, even if it's temporary fencing. It doesn't have to be permanent necessarily. If you got electric fence and you're trying to give them that extra protection at certain times of year, especially if you live in some of the windy areas of the province or those areas that get extra hot, maybe they're going to seek those areas out more. The other thing is portable. I think that portable shelter windbreaks are like a great tool, just like moving your salt block or your water is. So it's a portable windbreak type shelter that adds wind or shade, obviously. And there's lots of different varieties out there, but I think that's a great distribution tool as well.
Definitely.
And it saves your natural trees.
Better and better.
Yeah. A lot of times cows like to hang out under the trees or next to the trees because that protection they provide, obviously, but they also provide forage. So there's a reason, in addition to rubbing and just sort of physical damage, that you don't see any branches at the bottom, but they also eat them, right? So poplars and willows and aspen are really palatable, the young shoots in a lot of cases. And so that's why when you see willows along a stream or wetland, a lot of time they're very mushroom or umbrella shaped. That's not the natural shape of a willow. They should be bushy at the bottom and bushy at the top. But long-term use can, cause that loss. So if you can increase their opportunity to sprout and have those extra branches at the bottom, that'll be a good thing for that plant stand long term. And it can still provide forage resource as well.
Right. On that note of trees providing forage, we have a lot of boreal forest pasture up here in the piece. Are there plants or indicators that you really watch out for when you're looking at a boreal pasture as opposed to a plain tame pasture or maybe a grassland pasture?
Yeah, in general, I would say a lot of our sort of bush pastures end up being a mixture of kind of tame grasses like brome or Kentucky bluegrass underneath with mixtures of kind of like wildflowers, forbs or broadleaf plants mixed in with the trees. So it's hard to tell. It's like because it's not like a tame pasture where you can say, well, I'm going to leave X number of inches or X number of percentage, because you obviously aren't taking the trees, and you don't want, it's harder to see what level of grazing you're at and how much you've taken. But in general, you should treat them a bit like a native grassland, 25 to maximum 50% utilization of available annual forage. Like that's lots, because they are more sensitive, and you will eat out the other stuff. So, but I would definitely look at woodies. So they start eating the shrubbery. So things like the Saskatoon and the rose and the dogwood, those native shrubs will usually be part of the understory as well. And if that gets to be quite heavily browsed, looking like hedged or really well trimmed, then there's probably not enough other forage resource left for them, right? Obviously, once you start to see a real loss of structure, so there's trees and there's grass at the bottom or really short broadleaf plants, you've probably had long-term heavy impact of grazing. And people often say, well, yeah, but I'm creating more grass. That's what I want. I want more grass. And most of the work that Public Lands has done on their long-term research plots and managing and looking at forage production and stocking rates long-term show that actually leads to a decline in your forage productivity, because the diversity of things you have, a whole bunch of different grasses, different broadleaf plants, shrubs, trees, all together actually have more forage on an ongoing basis, if you can keep them all there, than just having reduced layers, like less stuff behind. And they require no inputs, right? There's no need to add fertilizer. There's no need to, replace it. It's maintains itself if you keep all those layers intact. So it's a fine line, but I would say watch for the woodies, and on the whole, a light intensity of grazing is probably needed to maintain all the pieces.
Neat. So on that note of light intensity and all of that sort of stuff, let's talk about resting your pasture. We talk about that at most levels of range management, whether you're conventional or organic or regenerative or any of that sort of stuff. Everybody talks about rest. So I know usually the time of like how long a pasture needs rest depends on what's in it and how heavily it's been used. So what sort of indicators can we look for to let us know that a pasture has had sufficient rest and we can come back to it?
Yeah, so kind of on the long-term perspective, you want to look at, do you have litter or residue that's from a prior year? So if there's no prior year material left, so this is assuming you're starting the first time for this year, let's say. If there's nothing left from a prior year, and all you've got is new growth for this year to focus on, probably it was overgrazed, because you haven't left anything behind the prior year, or you left very little behind the prior year, whether it weathered away or you actually ate it all or whatever, your cows did. So that's the first thing, litter, like making sure there's carryover from prior growing seasons. But then if you're still using it, like you might be going back more than once in the same growing season, the same idea applies. You want litter from prior years, but you also, of course, want growing residue left from the prior parts of the season, like say in the spring and you're there in the fall, right? You want some of that left. And every pasture is going to be different, but tame pastures can sometimes handle up to say 70% utilization. So you're leaving 25% once you're done, whether that's standing or laying down or some combination. But the old saying of take half, leave half is, it's not precise, but it gives you a kind of an idea of the reason you're leaving stuff isn't to waste it. That allows the plant to regrow and protects the roots with, the heat and the drying out. Otherwise that happens on the soil if there's nothing left to protect it. So look for litter and previous, even same season growth. Also look for browse on woody plants. So if you are in a situation where you have trees and shrubs, either because it's a bush pasture or it's got wetland and riparian area that are, it's got wooded areas and components. If you see a lot of browse on those things, that's not that it's not wildlife, because you probably know if you got lots of deer or elk or whatever, that's a sign that you probably not you've been browsing and grazing fairly heavily, and you might not have had enough rest. You probably need to give it more, because they do like trees and shrubs after they've chosen the best grasses, obviously, right? So woody use tends to increase when there's not much grass left, or it's not very palatable. So either, it's really late season, it's weathered away, and in the fall and winter, woodies tend to get more heavily used. So, but they also might be an indicator you were not giving it enough rest. So depends on the situation, but those are some things I'd look for. And always, if you're going back in, they have to have regrown.
Right.
They have to have regrown before you're going back, obviously.
Sounds right to me. So with all of that in mind, what are kind of your top 3, I guess, things we should be thinking about going into 2022, now that we've come through the drought? So what should we be thinking about for recovery for our natural riparian areas especially, but pasture generally?
The number one thing I would say is wait as absolutely long as you can to go into these places that last year had a really tough time. There was limited moisture. They very possibly got heavily grazed, more heavily than you might have wanted, because there was so little moisture and so little forage out there. So wait as long as you can. Every week you can delay in the spring can give you as much as 2 weeks in the fall or late summer use. So delay as long as you can, feed longer, use other means to delay. And that's true any year, but especially after a drought, when you really got to give it that extra rest in the spring to recuperate a bit more. And then plan flexibility. So be prepared to move to different spots. Maybe they won't respond as well or as quickly as they would on a normal year, because they're slowed down from having been grazed a bit heavier last year and are really dry. Maybe they're going to be really dry again going into the spring, and the soil moisture is just not there. So if that's the case, look at where are those opportunities for alternate water? And that was a big issue last year. Wasn't just the grass or the forage. There wasn't water for cattle to drink. So I would say start planning that now, if you haven't already, and look for whether you're hopefully not having to haul water, but where can you get that flexibility with actual water availability too.
That makes sense. Awesome. That's all the questions I had. Are there any resources you'd like to mention before we sign off? Where can we find cows and fish, all of that good stuff?
Sure. Of course, you can go to our website and look at some of our grazing management documents. Caring for the Green Zone, riparian areas and grazing management has lots of examples of different sort of timing, different kinds of rotation you might consider. Look, we have a lot of our webinars are now on our YouTube channel, so you can listen to presentations on grazing and management of various lengths and types. So there's lots of opportunities there. And of course, keep listening to the rest of these podcasts, the before ones and the after ones.
Awesome. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Norine. This was good as always.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was great to chat.
Always. Peace Country Beef and Forage Association is a research and extension group based out of Fairview, Alberta. Our mission is to help producers thrive in an agricultural system that is profitable, regenerative, and attractive to future generations. To learn more about what we do and see the results of our research trials or our archive of newsletters and fact sheets, check out our website at peacecountrybeef.ca. Want to get in touch? Have a burning question or a topic suggestion? Send us a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Thanks for listening.